Section 1 of The Dark Chamber by Leonard Klein. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Ben Tucker. The Dark Chamber by Leonard Klein. Part 1. Janet. Chapter 1 through 7. Chapter 1. Yesterday had been summer in the city, the end of summer stale and jaded, with the dejection in the air that dragged like an old skirt in the gutter. Tonight, in this loneliness of woods and stars high on the Palisades above the Hudson, it was brisk autumn. Rested already in the loose comfort of my pajamas, I threw up the ponderous window. Midnight gushed in, tripping up the yellow flame of the candle on the dresser, which wrestled gallantly with the dark invader, until in every corner of the lofty wainscoted chamber, shadows hunched and reared and panted, waiting their moment to pounce. And for a few minutes I lingered at the window, exulting in that gush of cool night, the fresh cleanness of it on my naked throat and ankles, and in the quietude broken only by the rustle of dry leaves on oak and hickory, so very quiet after all August, in a stifling closet beside the elevated. But from 3 hills away came suddenly a baying, and I remembered the huge dog Todd, coal-black Deutscherhund, whose snarl sinister as his name had been my first greeting to Mordaunt's Hall that afternoon. Now all we need, I thought, is the sound of horses galloping around and around this ruinous place, and not a horse to be seen, for that is a tradition of haunted houses, and Mordaunt's Hall, from the broken flags green with lichen of its crumbling terrace to the time-stained panelwork of the seigneurial hall that rose 3 floors to a dusky skylight, would convince the most skeptical. The sound of galloping horses, and perhaps a phosphorescent face drifting pinched and stricken through the night, and perhaps just now a cry. Shivering suddenly, I turned from the window and surveyed the chamber in which for the winter at least I was like to dwell. In the light of the one taper, as it bent and twisted in the wind, the lines of the room wavered into queer angles and slants, and darkness crouched behind tall wardrobe and wide poster bed, armchair and table. Half to the ceiling the walnut wainscot mounted, and in each corner were wood pilasters supporting the crenellated molding. From an elaborate oval relief in the middle of the ceiling hung an antique chandelier of glittering glass, but there was no gas in the empty pipes, and fixtures for electricity had never been installed in any part of the house. It was an idiosyncrasy of Richard Pride's, lord of the place and my patron, that he could tolerate only the mild light of candles. I'd been very tired when I came upstairs to bed. Now, with the bay of the dog still in my ears, I was stark awake. I took the candle from the dresser and crept across the thick carpet to the bed, and there I put it on a low table. With a voluptuousness of fatigue, I let myself down into the soft pillows and lit a cigarette. Indeed, this was a haunted place. Strange people were here, and it had been the most fantastic peradventure that brought me to join them. And so far I knew no more than ever what service I, a maker of music, was expected to render in connection with those experiments of a semi-scientific nature upon which Richard Pride was engaged. I had not even met Mr. Pride, who had been called away unexpectedly and might not return to Mordaunt's Hall for a week or more. Wilfred Huff, his secretary, came to the Edgewater ferry to pick me up early in the afternoon. Surely he was no assuring spectacle. He was thin and stooping and soft-chinned, and he spoke with a pathetic squeak. If there were ghosts at Mordaunt's Hall, they would never think to spook at him. They might mistake him in the dark for a distant cousin of theirs, I reflected, trying to remember him lightly. But he was so haggard, so drained, and I could not help remembering a book I'd been reading, a book on vampirism. Damn, I said aloud, and I groped for something less suggestive to fasten my mind upon. 15 miles we had driven north from Edgewater. If it was not a dream, if I was not dreaming, and twice we had turned, plunging into a stretch of forest that was quite virgin, sprawling estates with only a rough stone gate at intervals along the road to indicate, far back behind the trees, a human habitation. Through just such a gate at last we turned, and 1/2 mile down a narrow sandy lane between pines and birches and squat gnarled hornbeams, wild country beautiful in its neglect, teeming with purple asters and great patches of scarlet ivy. Then we emerged from the fragrant shadow and crossed a small lawn and drew up at the porte cochere of Mordaunt's Hall, neglected as were the woods, and seeming empty until the great dog came challenging across the terrace. "Down, Todd," commanded Huff, and Todd, without a glance at the secretary, as if recognizing the delegation of authority in this meeching famulus, but contemptuous of its representative, did but sniff at my heels when I dismounted, with a little low thunder in his throat and his shoulders half bristling. Todd. Death. What a forbidding name for a dog. And what a barghest for such a name. There was something grisly lurking always in the smallish eyes of a police dog, something disconcertingly swift and crafty and inimical. One feels it is no canine love or respect that keeps him from molesting one, but cunning. The beast is merely biding his time. There was no dog, too, that gives one such an apprehension of savage strength, and Todd among his kind would stand inches above the mightiest. But Huff pulled open a massive door that creaked rustily on its hinges, and I stepped into the entrance hall, and there on the threshold I halted with amazement. It was an enormous apartment 50 feet from floor to ceiling, with the darkness little more than stained and made apparent by the red glow from a fireplace at the far end, and the yellow of candles in 2 ancient iron girandoles, one at each side of the door. A canvas by some drugged and dream-rid Fleming, pupil of von Stuck, with the fierce superstitions of the 17th century in his blood, hung over the hearth. I discerned the whiteness of a twisted thigh and the stare of serpent's eyes from a deep bituminous background. Octagonal marble tiles fitted together without cement, loosening now after so many years and giving way here and there under heel, floored the room. At 2nd and 3rd story levels were balconies with heavy carved balustrades, and in one corner a door stood ajar. Hushed with marveling at this legendary place, I followed Huff up a broad stairway and around the first balcony to the door that hung open. This chamber in which I now lay. Fidgeting with an apology for them, Huff touched match to candles. Then he left me alone, still mute and wondering. The long table in the vast manorial dining room was laid for 4, with the richest of silver and the most opulent of linen, by the light of 4 tall tapers. So with Huff making up the party, I met Mrs. Pride and her daughter Janet. It was music we talked about, hardly a word of Richard Pride, nothing of his researches, although curiosity tantalized me. Miriam Pride had known New Orleans when the old French opera flourished, and Janet was familiar with Ravel and Stravinsky. But there would be a lecherous muted whine in her orchestration, I thought, watching her eyes. Skillfully, in a manner cordial and flattering, and ostensibly incurious, Mrs. Pride directed the conversation until presently it was of my music we talked, of study in Europe, and of my studies there, and finally by a circuitous route of my family. In the wide doorway lay Todd, muzzle on forepaws, ears pricking, yellow eyes fixed in a state that seemed never to shift, and yet always to follow the conversation from one speaker to another. "Indeed, he is a magnificent dog," I remarked. "But I think you might have chosen a more comfortable name for him. He's terrifying enough just to look at. Will he ever make friends with me?" Mrs. Pride laughed. "Todd is a peculiar animal. He makes friends with no one, very easily. He is Mr. Pride's dog." "You're to be congratulated if he recognizes you at all," commented Janet. "He doesn't even growl at me. He ignores me completely. He doesn't seem to see me. Actually, he looks quite through me. Watch when I speak to him." So I watched, and she spoke. "Todd," she said sharply, and then with the most affectionate suasion, "Come, Todd, good dog. Come on, Todd, come here." The hard eyes gleamed in the candlelight. Level, they stared at the girl, and I would have sworn they saw nothing. It was eerie, and I was glad when Janet took the conversation over a row of hurdles and asked what I thought of astrology. "Isaac Newton believed in it, so did Goethe," she observed, frowning. "I don't know, but sometimes predictions are surprisingly accurate. My moon is a rover. I shall never amount to anything." I could laugh at astrology. Janet laughed too, although with a word of reservation, and Huff's pale face was a ghostly smear of deferential mirth. Mrs. Pride did not laugh. She was one of those disturbing people who never laugh at what seems ridiculous to others, never at a witticism or an absurdity, but now and then she would laugh all by herself at a commonplace statement of fact or opinion, a cynical laugh in which her eyes were angry and her mouth contemptuous. And one felt that she saw into deeper significances relative to some very personal, brooding, and quite embittered experience of life. Mrs. Pride could laugh at Todd, but I could not. And lying now alone in my bed, with the candle guttering on the low table at the bedside and the cigarette cold in my fingers, I found myself musing upon an eldritch fancy indeed. For I thought, this is a haunted place, this manor of Mordaunt's Hall. It is all under a spell, and the 4 of us who dined together tonight, and the young negress who went about so silently serving us, we too are under a spell. Over woods and ruinous mansion, over lonely day and crawling night, falls the purpose of Richard Pride, who watches us and keeps us for unspeakable, mysterious ends. And when the truth is finally told, I shall never sit down with Richard Pride at dinner, because there is no Richard Pride. For Richard Pride and the great dog Todd are one and the same. It is he who is my master. Lycanthropy, werewolf with yellow eyes. Out of this reverie I clutched. The taper had spilled a puddle of wax and was far consumed. Without daring to glance again around that ancient chamber, I blew out the light and resolutely shut my eyes. Chapter 2. Miriam Mordaunt's pride and her daughter Janet. Something of the mother, more of the girl, I saw during the 3 or 4 days after my coming to Mordaunt's Hall. I found them fascinating, each in her particular quality of passion and of frustration. Physically, they resembled each other in their dark hair and small but delicately modeled stature, just as they did in the tragic intensity that turned sometimes in the depths of their eyes. But Miriam's was a more profound and a controlled torment, which left her at least the manner of composure, festering at heart and saturnine in its bearing, while Janet's fretted and stung and expressed itself in a manic pathognomy of sharp laughter following hard on puzzled frown, and a restlessness that took her dizzily from mood to mood and interest to interest. Yet Miriam was a felled trunk whose core swirled with the coiling glow of phosphorus, but done outside, giving no sign of that fire, and Janet was a hill by a marsh, frantic with the flitting of will-o'-the-wisps. A year or two more than 40 was Miriam Pride, born in New Orleans, child of a Creole mother and a father whose blood mingled elements of Hebrew with strains of French several generations removed from his ancestral Gascony. She had been gently reared and carefully educated, and she had aspired to a career on the stage, and had displayed precocious talent in some minor professional parts before Pride, much older than she, swept her into his arms after a vehement courtship. She never returned to her art. Now, in her Venus prime, she was a creature of lush loveliness, languid and yet aware of life with a keen and eager sensuality. She was a music to which a thwarting hand had written a profound and disturbing bass, and the voluptuous appeal of her was dignified by that patrician refinement, that alert pride which an admixture of Jewish blood so often contributes. It was she who had selected the queer canvas of Van Atter, which hung over the hearth, and another of his that I discovered later, hidden away, a picture of an apocryphal Tyrolean saint of the Middle Ages crucified, with one female breast very seductive, and a beard, and a golden slipper on one spiked foot, the other bare, before whom sat a minstrel playing on his viele. It was she indeed who scrutinized the stars and foretold futures from them. She read Willem Müller and the fantasies of Gustavo Adolfo Becker in the original, and Baudelaire endlessly, and Eliphas Levi, and those innumerable rhapsodies of Aleister Crowley, monstrous alike in erudition and obliquity. She seemed in all her sensitive recognition of life to hang suspended in a trance of horror. Prodigious willfulness was the impression Miriam made on me, and by the light of this her companionship with Wilfred Huff seemed very odd, for almost always when she roused from a reverie or a book and strolled across the terrace toward the cliffs to the east or the woodsy ravines to the west, he would appear and fall into step at her side. In the house one would come upon them at chess, Huff silent and puzzling, Miriam breaking her taciturnity only with an occasional sneer as she moved swiftly through his disconcerted defenses toward an inevitable checkmate. Surely there was some understanding between them, more than merely casual companionship. Miriam might have been expected to seek in this lonely place with the only person available in the absence of Pride. Once bent on detecting them, I could remark many a quick exchange of glances between the two. Not that there was ever in her expression any hint of tenderness or infatuation when she would look at Huff. That would have been preposterous. Miriam and this shill-pit secretary. Conspiratorial, rather, was their meeting of eyes, with a trace of speculation in Miriam's, and a cloud of anxiety in Huff's. And watching them, contrasting the abundant crimson of her moist lips with the sapped pallor of Huff's cheeks, I remembered the gruesome idea my first glimpse of the secretary had evoked. Quite early Miriam retired, and not long afterward Huff took himself off. Yawning with the sleepy warmth of the Ingleside, Janet and I stepped out on the terrace and smoked a cigarette. "Have you ever seen Mrs. Pride on the stage? I think she would be quite wonderful in certain roles. Electra or Salome.
Do you think so, really? Janet laughed. You should tell her. She would be flattered and not at all interested. I rather hoped to go on stage myself at one time, when I was in college.
And that gave her a vicarious satisfaction?
Not in the least. I played Melisande, and she never so much as wrote me a note about it, much less come down to see the performance. But that was just as well, because I met a painter and forgot Melisande and made a terrible idiot of myself. So I relinquished my dreams of a theatrical triumph and decided to paint.
Janet glanced at me with a pucker of lips that was not entirely amused.
I painted 7 pictures, and then I met a lawyer. So I read 3 chapters of Blackstone, and then I met a landscape artist. He was really a nice boy and had a lot of talent. I brought him out here. Poor Philip. We got a tree half planted, and then Todd decided he didn't like the improvement.
Your father, I ventured. I'm very curious.
So, my dear Oscar, am I, and you are likely to be gratified sooner than I. My father is much like his dog. He can't seem to see me, even when I ask him for tribute. It's chilly. Let's talk of something pleasant. Will you teach me how to write music?
Fire lighted and directed as yet to no end. That was Janet. She was song before it is fashioned, the fugitive suggestion of melodies before, selected and defined, they are woven together in the one conclusive pattern. She was a tingle of sweet flesh, bewildered by the multiple potentialities of life. She was beautiful, and surely she could be tender. She was yet to be composed. Chapter 3. In orpiment and filament, the pageant woods glowed in the luminous golden afternoon. My eyes made glad by so much color, my spirit jocund itself to watch the frolic lustihood of bird and squirrel life in the trees. I followed Huff down a path that dipped through a hollow northward from Mordaunt's Hall. As we went over the farther crest, the hickories thinned away, and presently we emerged in a clearing. This was a superb setting, and for a moment I stood smitten by the glory of it. Sheer to the brink of the palisades the woods were cropped off. There, 200 feet below, swung the broad blue eager of the Hudson, and over past him clustered the standing hills. This was a stage, and it was built for giants. The curving woods were backdrop in that granite-lipped proscenium, and I felt suddenly very small and mean, for the hills were audience. How they must hold their sides and guffaw to see such cockchafer heroes step thus out of the wings. But no, they gave no sign of seeing us at all. They are regarding, I mused, the afternoon. He kneels here now in prayer, that young knight, and soon the sunset will slay him, and the evening steal to his side and cover him over. This is that ancient tragedy. But Huff stood looking with his back to the hills, and at last I looked in the direction he indicated.
That is Mr. Pride's study. You'll be working with him there.
The study of Richard Pride. I had not noticed it at first. The gray of the stone blended so closely into the gray of the trunks, and the blue-gray mist between them, even in full daylight. It was as if a flattish head thrust out from the trees. Those surely were eyes, not windows, and that a broad snout, not a door. And as I stared, I could discern shoulders and a ridged spine behind them, partly concealed in the foliage. By no architecture but his own imagination had Richard Pride planned the thing and built it 15 years ago. Now I understood better what it was the hills so intently regarded. This complicated the drama, this peering monster. What part did it play?
It's an extraordinary place, and larger than you would think. The ground drops away, you see. There are 3 stories in the rear. That's what we call the stacks, and there Mr. Pride keeps his records.
But what are the records?
Let's walk on, then. The afternoon is so fine. I want to try to explain to some extent what Mr. Pride is doing. Then you may glance through this.
Huff tapped a thick notebook that he carried under his arm.
And it will explain further. Mr. Pride is very eager not to be misunderstood.
So we crossed the clearing and dropped again into the woods, which seemed hushed and purposive and expectant now, more dusky and mysterious.
Mr. Pride, Huff was saying, is a most remarkable man. You'd hardly take him to be more than 50. I'm not yet quite 40, but he is much stronger than I. His senses and all his faculties are electrically sensitive, and his vigor and endurance nothing less than marvelous. When you consider that for almost a quarter of a century now, he has devoted all his energy to the experiments in which he hopes you will assist him, the most confining and exacting work for him at least, his vitality is seen to be all the more astonishing. For Mr. Pride is nearly 70 years old.
We paused to light cigarettes, and I observed that it would not argue much for Mr. Pride to point out that his hand was steadier than that of his secretary, for Huff's was trembling badly. He jerked away from my match and puffed for a minute in silence, slicing fretfully at blown weed and drooping bough with his stick as we continued on.
Admirable as he is now, it's not hard to imagine that Mr. Pride must have been something of an heroic figure in his young manhood. His family was rich and socially distinguished, and he began life under the most auspicious circumstances. He was more than capable of taking advantage of them. He travelled every part of the world, visited every fine city, and was entertained in many a court. He was much of an adventurer, but much too of a scholar. His explorations in Yucatan laid the foundation for many recent discoveries in the Maya history and culture, and he made important contributions to the study of Peruvian archaeology. Also, he married late, you see, and, well, his contacts with women during these years are to be classed rather with his adventures. Yes, he was Don Juan and Marco Polo made into one. Probably no man ever had such opportunities and was so equipped to enjoy them. At least, I never heard of such a man, never read of one in the most extravagant romance.
Yes?
And then one day, at the very height of his enjoyment, on the eve of his most abounding happiness, something happened that brought him short with a pang. He became aware suddenly of the actual poverty of existence. It is so fugitive. Of all the fates had lavished on him, there remained nothing. He possessed the moment at hand, the moment just past, no more than these. Carelessly, he had let his days slip from his hands, and they were lost, utterly lost. Beauty and triumph together, days and nights and whole seasons, gone. Do you understand?
The pale eyes full of anxiety worried on mine, and I was faintly amused, but I had no heart to mock him. The story of Richard Pride, outlined so cursorily, had impressed me. No doubt what Wilfred Huff said about him was extravagant. Nevertheless, he would be well worth meeting, someone to sit with and talk. Of course I understand. Other men have come to the same realization, haven't they? Isn't that the motive which animated Pepsis and Casanova and countless other diarists? They try to recapture the vanishing past and keep the swift present, embrace the whole scope of a life. We had circled through the woods. We faced south again now, where toward the western ridge the sun was sliding down into the somber flare and quick nightfall of an autumn day's end. Underfoot the dried leaves crackled, and the pungent odor of them was heavy beneath the branches.
And so Mr. Pride began a journal. More than that, he began to seek out the old years. Here, in this, you'll find some of the first entries.
At last Huff gave me the volume, and I glanced into it, finding the pages yellowed and brittle and the ink fading. But the experiments, I suggested. Just in what way does this compilation of Mr. Pride's autobiography affect me? How does he expect me to help? Then an idea occurred to me, arrested me by the weight of its own monstrousness. You don't mean he's filling those stacks with his memoirs? 3 floors of them. I could not help smiling. Huff stiffened defensively.
You have no comprehension of the magnitude of Mr. Pride's project, or the searching method by which he has approached it. I may add that his work has opened up new reaches of investigation, which really I've not had time to follow. Very little of that comes before me. I advise you to look over this notebook. It will prepare you to meet Mr. Pride, and I dare say you'll find him interesting.
Once again we came out into the clearing where crouched that grotesque study of Richard Pride's, now in the thickening slate-colored evening merging more closely into the woods. I thought of the enormity of the madness which sought to fill those spacious shelves with the chronicles of dead hours, more than a man could ever read, even did he choose to spend his life at it. But then I remembered Huff's broad summary of Richard Pride's life, the most replete of all human careers, beyond even the dreams of romance. And I reflected what brave stories must be filed away in that mysterious Domdaniel, what spectres must linger in its corridors, what pathos of beauty so desperately cherished. Silently we crossed the lawn, busy each with his meditations. And what were Huff's, I cannot say. But mine, as we thrust into the woods, were weird enough, for it came upon me how like that squat place was, their muzzle on 4 paws, there the great bristling shoulders, to the beast Todd as he lay in a doorway and stared upon us. Chapter 4. If it is true that the memory of an experience, the memory picture, as they say, or the neurogram can never be effaced, but remains forever etched on the sensitive plate of the nervous tissue, somewhere, somehow, then all of my life is ready to hand, provided only that I can find the instrument with which to uncover it. So began the journal of Richard Pride, which Huff had given me, and which that night, alone in my Gothic chamber by the pale flicker of candles, I studied. In a broad free hand it was written, but from time to time the words crowded close, or sprawled and tripped over each other as the vehemence of the writer harried them across the page. If it is true, as psychologists are agreed, that the memory picture is ineradicable, for they contend, and their evidence is plentiful, that everything once seen or heard leaves its impress to endure to the very end of life. So, in old age, the processes of senescence, while they blunt the senses and deprive one of one's memory of recent events, seem to release certain veils, and lo, into one's own mind streams a whole flood of memories out of the far past. Forgotten memories, names and faces and deeds that one has not thought about for decades. And so, in that suspension of consciousness, which comes at the incidence of death, all of one's path glows clear and fresh and living in the sick mind. And their experiments, the psychologists, with subjects under hypnotism, or in certain nervous states to probe the memory, are amazingly suggestive. I cannot stop thinking of that classic instance of the old woman, a peasant person quite uneducated and unfamiliar with Latin or with pharmacology, who recited, while under hypnosis, a long list of drugs. She had seen these on the bottles on some apothecary's shelves, probably while waiting for a prescription to be filled, and probably also without being conscious of seeing them. She may have been thinking of something entirely different, but the memory picture was fashioned, and there laid away in her unconscious it endured, until a contingency suddenly revealed it. There is a queer enchantment in this theory, for it would seem that all our past, our joys and sorrows, our lost friends, and our achieved deeds grow into us, become an integral part of us, our flesh and blood of us, and thus we are bone and sinew our past years. In my breast beating with my heart, living in the swing of my blood, stored away in nerve filament and fiber, are the women I've loved and the friends whose hands I've taken. In my fingers, my seas and ships, in my flanks, my mountain peaks, in my cranium, from which I peep at this paper, my moons and suns. I shut my eyes, I wait behind the closed lids, I rove my veins and explore my bosom. Presently the darkness thins away, the moon is high already, and a night I'd forgotten. Little waves plash against the ancient piles of a quay, and there 2 vagabonds lie snoring, bundles of shadow. And there a pile of cordage and tackle drips and exudes an odor of brine and fish, and by my side is Ava. Strange mad girl, how long were her black lashes? Not 25 years ago, but now and forever. In me and of myself, ineradicably mine. Late into the morning I pored over the notebook of Richard Pride, pausing from time to time over certain entries which told, in a passionate manner that seemed singing, an extraordinary narrative. Just what tragic eventuality it was that had made Pride aware of his past, the journal did not say, but I gathered that it must have been about the time of his marriage to Miriam. At first his experiments were in the nature of play. He had come to see the possibilities of memory, that was all. Casually, in moments of leisure, on a train or tram, at the theater during a dull act, he would solicit some vouchsafement out of his past. It was angling, it was sport to him, and he indulged in it without system or particular intent. He was alert, realizing their value, to seize and secure those occasional unexpected revelations that come with an odor or a phrase of music, a color or dream. Odors in particular seduced him. "I have recovered an afternoon," he wrote triumphantly one time, "out of the shadow, a living ember out of the ash. At dinner today we were served a heavy puree of pea soup. With the first whiff of odorous steam that came to my nostrils, there was conjured up a stretch of countryside, and an old friend and a dog, one afternoon when I was a boy, in midsummer when the hay was newly mown. Yes, in a moment that afternoon was living again. In the hayloft of the great red barn, 2 boys and a puppy romped, threw themselves from high rafters into the hay, tussled and hid and shouted and pranked. In the end there was no way to get down again for the puppy but to be dropped, and so finally, in desperation, his master held the squirming terrier out over a pile of hay on the floor, 30 feet below, and let him fall. He struck sickeningly and lay as if paralyzed. Dizzy with terror, the boys clambered down to his rescue. But it was fright and not hurt that ailed him. Presently he was on his feet, and the three were off at full gallop down a long hill to the pasture lot, where a cool white brook curved into a swimming pool. How inexpressibly amiable the sun was on bare skin, coming out of the cold spring water and scampering naked about the fields. Yes, for a moment I lived once more that afternoon, miraculous, quick and pulsing and shimmering with sun. The sweet smell of the clover drenched with sunlight in the meadows, the coolness of shade beneath the tall elms, the caress of water. Then the magic is ended. Reality snaps back upon me. I am aware with a gasp of the dinner table. Someone is talking to me. A servant is filling my glass. "Pardon me," I stammer, embarrassed. "I didn't just understand what you were saying. The Soviets in Canton?" But the moment was mine, and I kept it. All evening by myself I lingered with it. In all its detail I have recovered it. I could write a volume about it. I know all that joy once more. I frolic with the yelping puppy. I wrestle with my companion and chase him across the fields. Tired at last with the complete aching weariness of boyhood, I turn home, up a long dusty slope and around a bend where a maple tree stands, broad branches reaching clear across the road. All this in a thin wisp of steam from a bowl of soup. So an odor, suggesting another odor, which itself is woven into a memory picture, evokes the whole picture. The veil lifts for an instant. The dust stirs into the old shapes. There is a rift in the present, and the past is seen through it. Vivid in beauty. What miracle could be more marvelous than this? It was shortly after this episode that Richard Pride made a beginning of systematic investigation. For, musing still on that afternoon, and on others which it recalled, he took pen and paper one idle evening and blocked out a chart of the years he had lived. 40 years, season by season and month by month, he laid out. Then, in general way, he wrote in localities, spanning the world before he caught up with its present, and incidentally, as he added these, he put in names that came to mind. But he brooded over the result, baffled by so many hiatuses, such vast uncertainties. This first effort to scan the whole pageant of his life made all the more clear to him how much he had lost. To seek his Christmases year after year, his very birthdays, and find the half of them missing. To think that a birthday could be forgotten. To think that so much as one moonlit night can ever be utterly lost. A night of love beneath the moon. A night of long ramble by brookside and hill. A night of tranquil wandering on that pale luminous circle, thin Selenic host, swinging in a monstrance of darkness a profane benediction, exquisite in its starry pecs. They are ecstasies of life, these moonlit nights. It is incredible that one should ever forget them, and one forgets them all. But reflecting further on his spent holidays, Richard Pride discovered that between locale and date, a name and a place, and with some deliberate mnemonical effort, he could retrieve them one by one. Presently excited by the treasures of remembrance his endeavor yielded, he did a rather startling thing, for he procured data on the times of full moon and new moon in last quarter, year by year back to his infancy. Records of rain and clear weather, storm and snow. With these he prepared a new chart of his life, but this new chart was not included in the journal which Huff had given me, for 1 page to a month for more than 20 years, it ran to some 500 pages. It was difficult for him to get reports from many places covering such meteorological matters. Pride took time to write consular agents and business acquaintances in several remote lands for such information. In the course of the correspondence that developed during the following year or two, he sent orders also in many cases for photographs. On occasion he would go himself to cities and lands that he had visited long before. He would hunt out old people who had been his friends, explore neighborhoods he once frequented, hunt out shops and taverns and libraries he had known, doors he had hovered near at night, windows beneath which he had loitered. Obviously it was impossible for him in person to cover so wide a range, and soon he adopted the practice of employing from time to time capable investigators to do this research for him, to send him copious notes, transcripts from newspaper files, photographs, interviews. One such investigation had to do with a moonlight adventure in a fastness of Abyssinia, among the Buddhas. They are a tribe of smiths and potters, dreaded by their neighbors because of their reputed power to change themselves into hyenas, working great witchcraft. and Pride, then a young man vacationing from Oxford, made one of a party of Europeans who, scoffing at a rumor of this kind, proposed to capture and expose the deception of the supposed sorcerer. 3 natives who insisted they had seen the transformation were bribed, by sufficient to make them local rich men for life, to lead the party to the sorcerer's retreat. The sorcerer fled. So night after night the chase proceeded, through wilderness creeping with furtive life. Now, the guides would have turned back if the hunters had not compelled them to continue. Every day, as the pursuit led deeper into the lonely hills, the protestations of the terrified guides grew louder and more extravagant, until at last the very scoffers could not help feeling restless and apprehensive, and tense with nervousness. Then finally, down a glade that swirled with moonlight, they saw their quarry dodge away, manlike but fleeing with strange agility. Now quite unnerved, one of the party shouldered his rifle and shot, and there was a deathly scream on the silence. Gathering their shaken courage, the hunters ran up. In the brush, mortally wounded, it was a hyena they found, with gold rings such as the Buddhas wear in his tufted ears. The investigator Pride was fortunate in finding to unearth the records of this eerie adventure, to talk it over with the one native guide surviving, to go himself to the very scene of the shooting, was a vagabond newspaperman. His work was most thorough, precise in its detail, reported with color and enthusiasm. So impressed was Pride that he offered the man a considerable salary to remain permanently in his employ, and thus began the organization of a staff of investigators, detectives, photographers, moving picture operators which multiplied in time to 38, fairly covering the world which Pride had made his past. He walks behind me in my very footprints, very close, his breath on my ear. Oblivion, arch-rogue, thieving my hours from my hands even as I gaze upon them, dropping them silver and gold into his black pocket. But he is less than I, and the bright coins are mine, and he will return them. I solicit him. I flatter and cajole him. Often I threaten, and sometimes I lay my fingers upon his throat. And one by one he restores to me the riches he has stolen. Come, I shall follow him into the dark chamber where he dwells, and ransack his piled chests, and explore his ancient corridors, and kindle a light in the blackness of the caverns of his treasure vaults. I shall recover it all, my riches, mine, my hours minted in yellow and white, the face of each of them my face, in smiles or tears. My life. At the time of this entry, Richard Pride was devoting many hours a day to his researches. The chart of his life, by month and moon, had developed into a vast skeleton system, with more than 3,000 principal categories, and innumerable subdivisions, contrived so that it could be expanded without limit. But it was now merely a scheme of cataloging. The compilation of indexed records already had begun. Chapter 5. To think that one can ever forget a moonlit night. I closed that odd journal of Richard Pride's and mused for a while, staring at my candle. I remembered an incident that gave me pause myself. One day, some years ago, when the shadow of oblivion leaning over me was seen for a moment with startling clarity. A friend of mine, a painter of landscapes who knew with the Chinese how much nearer infinite reality a hill could be than a face, was glancing with me through the pages of a catalogue of an art exhibition a decade previous. Among the illustrations of paintings hung in it, we came across one that caused us both to exclaim, and then we looked for the name of the artist who had done the lovely thing, and it was the name of my friend.
"Good God!" he ejaculated with a laugh. "I had forgotten all about it."
With an access of interest, he bent over the reproduction, searching it with new understanding, and some doubt, and deep love.
"It was rather good, too, wasn't it?" He meditated. "The values are true, and the composition isn't bad at all. Where the devil can the thing be now? Somebody bought it at that very show, and I presume by this time it's stowed away in his attic, or burned, or sold to the junk man."
He could not take his eyes from the page. He pored over it, quite grave and quite pathetic, and he recalled the morning he fetched his paint-box into the woods and dreamed and did the picture. Cascade and willows and mouldering dam of mossy stones. How completely he had lost it all, until this coincidence spread a page before his eyes, and there was the record. Scant comfort in an art which must destroy itself in order to endure, I thought, for the sale of a painting is too often destruction of it, so far as the painter is concerned. Poets have the better of painters and composers likewise. Their works exist in multiple editions, and they need never dispose of them. And the work of every artist, not a commercial hack, is essentially the lovingly wrought memoir of a beautiful hour. But one must be quick to seize the hour and carve it, I reflected. And it occurred to me how many of my own hours I'd neglected to preserve, like Richard Pride with all of his, like my friend the painter with so many of his. How many years I have lost. Orion with his jeweled buckler was vaulting up out of the east. Mars bore the baleful flare of his torch down into the west, in a sky one glitter of stars when I looked out of the window. It was very late and quite cold, and I found myself shivering. There was a feeling in me, too, that I must not think too much about such things as these, and I conned a scene of the ballet on which I was working, and went to bed, resolutely chanting its chorus. Chapter 6. Janet was driving to the village and invited me to go. Huff waved us farewell, and as we turned the corner in the lane we saw him still where we had left him, leaning on his stick.
"Wilfred," said Janet, "is the reincarnation of a Salvation Army lassie, or of a Christian martyr, or of a lapdog, not the kind that would jump up on your lap, the kind that would wait to be picked up. You would hardly believe that he was a good-looking boy when he came to Mordaunt's Hall, but he was. I fell in love with him, of course."
"Did anyone ever fall in love with Wilfred, of course?"
"Well, I meant rather that when he first came, I fell in love. Of course, one falls in love with people when they first come, like yourself, my dear. I presume I shall be falling in love with you for a while."
That argues little for love. Her boldness was palpably not just bantering. She confused and irritated me, and now, without the cynical laugh I expected, she replied quite seriously.
"I couldn't argue much for love. Love is the conviction that a certain man offers, without any disagreeable personal traits, the opportunity one has been awaiting to gratify a biological craving. And if one has been waiting very long, one can even overlook a few disagreeable personal traits. When Wilfred arrived, I thought I saw my opportunity."
She glanced at me quizzically to see perhaps if I was shocked.
"You may be gratified to know that Wilfred did not reciprocate. He saw no opportunity at all. Really, I'm gratified myself now, although it did pique me at the time."
Out of the lane we wheeled into the high road, and once on hard gravel Jane slid into a reckless speed. For some minutes I could only cling to my seat, anticipating a hurtle into the ditch, but Janet was sure of herself, drove easily and without excitement, and presently her expertness calmed me. "How long has Wilfred been here?"
4 years. A little more, I imagine."
"That would make you 16?
"You mean when I was pursuing him? Yes, 16. Do you think that was rather young?" "It wasn't, my dear. Girls are somewhat different nowadays from what girls used to be. Even when you were in college. Short skirts, many of them write poetry. Why, in the name of God, should girls be cows?"
"There is no reason why they should become cows, but there is no reason either why they should become promiscuous. I'm no prude, Janet. There's much even in downright flappers that I like. I enjoy the way they carry themselves, their frankness and vigor and self-reliance. But don't you think some girls, too eager perhaps, fail to discriminate between the privilege of going their own way and the gesture of declaring that privilege by swerving off at a wry angle? They make a point of it, even when it outrages themselves. A generation to come, their daughters will be even more delivered, and not half so loose." My ardor had taken me to a point Janet might well resent as insolent in its suggestions, and I was about to stammer an apology, but she laughed derisively.
"Well, now, Father Oscar, I believe your text is promiscuity, and I'll grant you that this is something grandmothers generally abhor. Well, and how about George Sand? Didn't she haul window washers off their ladders when the notion struck her? On the other hand, somebody once pointed out that variety is the spice of life. Let's say zest. I don't remember that the observation was limited in its application. Variety in food, variety in love." I found nothing to answer. There was no more arguing with this malapert mood than halting the wild drive of her car. "Variety in love," she repeated. "How are you going to keep love without variety? How many lovers ever remain faithful? Nary a one. Fidelity for a month would bore me to death. I'd rather be chaste."
Suddenly in, she thrust the brakes, and skidding in the gravel, we brought up so abruptly that I was thrown forward against the windshield. Janet turned on me, vexed and quivering.
"Say something," she flared. "Oscar, why do you let me do all the talking? I'm going mad. Everybody up in this bedlam place is going mad. Father is a maniac. Mother's a witch. Wilfred is turning into a snake. And you'll go mad too before the winter's out. But for God's sake, while you're still sane, talk to me."
She leaned back panting at the wheel, and then presently she set her foot on the starter and we proceeded toward town, but now less headlong. "What do you want me to talk to you about?" I said at last quietly, repressing my curiosity over this distracted outburst. "Do you care to tell me more about yourself? You don't seem very happy. What is it, Janet?"
"Tell me about your work," she insisted. "However does one decide to write music? Is it very hard to learn?"
"No, not hard to learn, the mere writing of music. And I always wanted to compose. But whether one has anything of importance to write, that depends on how one lives and what one thinks, and is for the future to decide. It's quite easy to learn and very, very comforting. Do you mean it when you ask me to teach you?"
"Yes, really, I mean it." She smiled. "You'll have a precocious pupil who will never get past the beginning. That's the way with everything I do. Begin, Oscar. I've never finished anything in my life."
"I won't insist that you finish this. Most of us never do that. I think Brahms came nearer the end than any of the rest. But we will have many pleasant hours together."
"And are you writing music now? What are you writing?"
So I told Janet, while we swept on northward through the woods and the sun pontificated from his scarlet chancel, about Helion. I told her how Raymond Laurier, that sensitive poet, became enamored of a girl who called herself Woe, and how he tried to inspire in her his understanding of love. Male and female is all of the history of the universe, but they are one thing, and the sun is its symbol. The sun is the very flame of the embrace. Gazing on the stars, Raymond would wonder over so many suns, and over those cold dead stars invisible to us that go questing through the blank endlessness of ether, until star meets star, and they together become one whirl of fire, one splendor of candescent mist, which cooling contracts and becomes a new sun. He took the sun for his protagonist, Helion, and the figures of male and female for antagonists, and with them Raymond Laurier created a missal of prose poems. These, with solo parts and choir and orchestra, and passages of interpretive dance, I was making into a ballet cantata. She remained silent, absorbed in her driving for a few minutes. We were approaching town and traffic was heavier. Then Janet said,
"What about the poet and his lady?"
I flushed and hesitated, mindful of Janet's cynicism in my protest. "The poet killed himself," I admitted.
"Because of the girl?"
"She was faithless to him."
"She was promiscuous?"
Janet eyed me with sharp and amused insistence. "Yes, she was promiscuous. Does that encourage you? It seems to me that the quality of love Raymond offered her was very beautiful, even if she was too coarse to appreciate it. And the ideal—"
"Don't be too harsh on the lady, Oscar. Coarse is a vindictive word. She was hardly to be scolded. She was simply prey to her instincts. She couldn't help herself. Indeed, it would appear that that is the very kind of woman poets become infatuated with, to their great distraction. I'm thinking of Ernest Dowson and his barmaid. And there we are. Very little wisdom I get from you. I find myself all the madder. Here's where we get out."
In the gloom of a small Syrian restaurant, empty save for two white-haired old men who puffed at a gurgling hookah and sipped corrosive coffee and played ponderously at chess, we sat together an hour and drank arak, tumbles full of that white spirit turning the water into opaline fog.
"I was born in the setting sun with Neptune afflicted in the mid-heaven."
Janet peered at me with her black eyes. Weird they could be with the erethism of the drug in them.
"This year the moon and Mercury are afflicted. I'm going mad. We are all mad, Oscar. Haven't you felt it?"
"Perhaps something," I faltered.
"Haunted might be better. What a strange old mansion Morden's Hall is."
She continued, still staring as if I had not spoken.
"Every now and then there is an explosion. It might have come by now if your arrival hadn't caused some diversion. Surely you must feel it all through the place. I don't know, but the tenseness seems to increase slowly all through a year, and then in one frantic eruption it bursts. The servants leave. Lord God, how I hate Morden's Hall."
"Then why do you stay?"
"I don't. I go away. Then I come back. There's nowhere else to go, nothing to do. Nothing at least for me to do. Morden's Hall gave me birth. It will bury me, no doubt. It compels me. There is more than a fascination about it, a necessity. Like life itself. What good does it do to ask a person why she stays alive? about watching Richard go groping into his cavern, with his face so white and his lips blue. About Miriam, Saturn, or Uranus. There's a configuration of stars the Greeks used to believe forecast a woman's destiny as priestess in the service of Aphrodite, Venus in the 9th house. Janet laughed. Mother has it.
I met her gaze directly and was moved to see hers falter. Janet, I said, I think it will do you good to learn music, to lose yourself and forget your perplexities in such a study. If you really are interested. Her hand was cold wax when I put mine upon it. So we talked of music. She was quick to understand. She had, of course, some knowledge of the art. She could play the piano. I talked, and I believe I became eloquent with the Iraq in my blood, and with that lovely girl beside me. Very lovely, and pitiful in her loneliness and confusion, and in her eagerness. The contour of your cheek is music, Janet. That is what melodies are, curves and contours, like the profiles of cliffs, like the veering of gulls, some of them infinitely tender, some of them majestic, some of them so pure and translucent that they wrap one up in light, cool one with white light. I held her hand. When we came out of the Syrians, it was dark. We were silent in the car, going the deserted road through the woods again. Our minds were empty as the sky, filled with lithe winds and little stars. As we crossed the clearing toward Mordaunt's hall, we saw the lanterns by the great door had been lighted.
I think, Janet murmured, that Father has returned.
Chapter 7. Richard Pride had come home, but I was not to meet him yet for another day. We dined, Mrs. Pride and Janet and I, in a mood of preoccupied taciturnity. Huff was absent, doubtless engaged with his master, although no one volunteered an explanation. Todd, too, was absent, and once or twice I made some comment on the dog, or on the secretary, or guardedly on Pride's arrival. Mrs. Pride responded in evasive monosyllables. Janet was dim in her own thoughts. And so when dinner was over and Mrs. Pride excused herself on the plea of headache, I feigned weariness likewise and took myself upstairs to my chamber to meditate on all that had happened, complicated by Janet's frowardness and distress. On my table lay the score sheets where, day after day, my song was taking shape. I read back through several pages to recover peace of mind and perspective. This was my work. Everything else was fortuitous, a means of securing my existence so that I could give strength and dreams to Helion. Here lay my purpose, and nothing must come between me and the fulfillment of it. So I pondered, and with the loveliness and the purity of that vision in my mind, it was easier to confront what now began to trouble me, the temptation of Janet. Did I love her? In a way, her raw analysis of love was true, and she was flamboyantly desirable with her slim, strong body, her broad, supple hips, her tropic lips and midnight hair, and beneath these visible beauties the unabashed fervency of her. Surely her embrace would be no gross emprise of vulgar flesh, but lyric and enchanted, self-conscious and dancing. She enjoyed Debussy. Her love would be cool as clarinets and warm as oboes, peregrine like his whole-tone harmonies, palely burning, but Melisande? What of the calamities she predicted? I might ignore her lugubrious predictions as the nightmares of an adolescent girl. Did everything at Mordaunt's Hall not seem subtly to confirm them? I looked out of my window, and over to the north, beneath lowering clouds, waved a fetch-candle flicker of light. There, Pride and his familiar took counsel. What did they plot? Indeed, this was an estranged and mysterious household. There well might be truth in Janet's warnings, and if the place were caught up in a whirl of madness and self-preservation, I must keep free of it. I would have need of infinite precaution, and under no circumstance could I allow myself to be tangled in an intimate relationship with any of the household. And besides, I did not love Janet, not as my lovers in Helion loved, with utter commingling of destiny and individuality, and defiance of the sunderer, sworn and increasing in union until the end. I considered a little that ideal love which is Helion, how rarely it has ever been achieved, how poet and singer have sought it like knights, the Grail and all have failed. Let us be cynical when we please. There is much wisdom in doubt, but this vision of perfect union is the heart of all beauty, toward which love ceaselessly strives, and the validity of it is certified by the passionate loyalty with which men have cherished from the beginning their legend of Helios and Abelard, of Isolde and Tristan. I do not love Janet, I told myself. I could enjoy her. There would be a sheaf of songs in her embrace, and were my Helion done, were there no portent of disaster hovering over Mordaunt's Hall, together we would seize our opportunity and find beauty in it. But my work lies before me. In the morning at breakfast, Janet greeted me clear-eyed and smiling and came with me jubilantly to the piano. Mrs. Pride did not come down for breakfast. End of section 1.